The clock doesn't start with a bang. It starts with a click, paper sliding across a polished bench in Jerusalem. May 29, 1962. 5 justices take their seats. A nation holds its breath. In a narrow cell south of the city, a thin, balding man lifts his eyes. He looks like a clerk, a neighbor, a face you'd forget by lunch. His name is Adolf Eichmann, the man who turned trains into weapons and timetables into tools of murder. His appeal is denied. 2 days left. You think you know what justice looks like. A villain foaming with rage, maybe begging or breaking. Not here. Here, evil is quiet. It files forms. It straightens its shirt. It asks when. While reporters ready their cables and diplomats call in favors, another clock starts to tick. A furnace is built. A rope is knotted. 13 steps are measured to the pound. In one room, a priest waits with last rites. In another, a young guard does not yet know his name will be etched beside a moment the world will never forget. All the while, Eichmann writes, pages of I followed orders, miles of I was only a cog. Not a word for the families torn apart. Not a syllable for the children packed into cars where the air ran out before the miles did. Midnight is coming. Not with fanfare, but with procedure. In these final 24 hours, you'll hear how a government built a machine of accountability as precise as the machine he once served, and why a man so ordinary could embody a truth more terrifying than monsters. Because sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it is exact. The morning of May 29, 1962, arrived without fanfare. The city of Jerusalem was awake, but the air felt heavier than usual, as if the desert itself knew that history was about to close a chapter written in blood. The Supreme Court building stood pale and rigid against the rising sun, its stone walls the same quiet color as the hills beyond. Inside, reporters whispered to one another in the marble corridors, the faint smell of cigarette smoke curling beneath the vaulted ceiling. Nobody spoke above a murmur. No one wanted to disturb the silence that comes before a verdict that would echo for generations. At exactly 9 in the morning, 5 justices took their seats behind the long wooden bench. Their black robes rustled softly as they opened their files. Each man carried the weight of a world still haunted by war. The president of the court, Yitzhak Olshan, looked down at the stack of papers before him, months of testimony, transcripts, and exhibits. The trial of Adolf Otto Eichmann had already entered history as one of the most meticulously documented proceedings ever held. Now, only a few pages remained unread. Eichmann himself was not in the courtroom. He sat miles away in a concrete cell at Ramla Prison, waiting for the outcome he already suspected. On the wall beside him hung a single light bulb that flickered every few minutes. The guard said he barely looked up anymore, except to adjust his glasses or to scribble something in the notebook that never left his side. He called it his memoir, though what filled those pages was not confession, but justification. Back in the Supreme Court, Justice Olshan cleared his throat. The room froze. A translator raised his headphones. Every word was being recorded, every syllable destined for archives, classrooms, and documentaries not yet imagined. The appeal, Olshan began, is rejected. The judgment of the district court is confirmed. The sentence of death shall stand. The sentence hung in the air. There was no applause, no collective sigh, only the shuffle of papers as the justices rose. Justice in Israel did not arrive with spectacle. It arrived quietly, deliberately, and absolutely. At Ramla, a warden walked briskly down the corridor. The keys on his belt clinked against the metal railings as he stopped before cell 7. Through the bars sat a man who had once moved entire nations with a pen stroke. Abraham Lavi, the prison warden, hesitated for a moment, as if rehearsing the line he had to deliver. Then he said it simply. Your appeal has been denied. The execution will proceed. Eichmann did not flinch. His pen hovered above the paper for a second. Then he placed it down neatly beside his notebook. He looked up and met the warden's eyes. There was no anger there, no terror, no sorrow. Only the dull composure of a bureaucrat who has just received a memo. When, he asked. Soon, the warden replied. And that was all. For months, the world had tried to imagine what evil looked like when finally brought to justice. They expected rage, tears, maybe a final burst of fanaticism. Instead, they found something more chilling, ordinariness. Eichmann was the embodiment of it. A man whose crime was not only what he had done, but how calmly, how efficiently he had done it. At Ramla, preparations began immediately. 22 guards were assigned to oversee him around the clock. All of them were Sephardi Jews, many from families that had never set foot in Europe. This was deliberate. Too many Ashkenazi guards bore the tattooed numbers of Auschwitz. Too many had lost mothers, brothers, entire bloodlines in the trains he had filled. The government wanted no revenge, only procedure. The execution of Adolf Eichmann had to be the antithesis of his life's work, precise, lawful, devoid of cruelty. Among those guards was a 26-year-old immigrant named Shalom Nugar. He was small, wiry, polite to a fault. For 6 months he had watched over the prisoner, testing his food for poison, ensuring his safety, recording his routines. Eichmann ate on time, wrote on time, and never missed his nightly walk from one side of the cell to the other. He spoke little, mostly to ask for more paper. To Nugar, he seemed less like a monster than a man who had long ago replaced his conscience with habit. Meanwhile, far north of Jerusalem, in the industrial town of Petah Tikva, another man was at work, Pinchas Zelikovsky. He owned a small oven factory that usually produced furnaces for fish processing plants. But this order was different. The state of Israel had quietly commissioned him to build something capable of reaching 1800 degrees Celsius. It would burn hotter than any industrial oven he had ever constructed. When his workers asked what it was for, he lied without hesitation. "It's for fish bones," he said. Industrial waste. The truth was a secret he would keep for the rest of his life. His furnace would consume the body of the architect of genocide. Back at Ramla, Eichmann sat cross-legged on his cot, writing in his neat, slanted hand. Page after page, he told the same story he had told for years. He was not a murderer, he claimed. He had never personally harmed anyone. He was merely a transportation specialist following the orders of his superiors. The same phrase appeared again and again. Befehl ist Befehl, an order is an order. The Israeli interrogators who had spent 9 months questioning him had heard it all before. They had shown him the documents bearing his own signature, the deportation lists, the correspondence with Himmler's office, the minutes from the Wannsee conference. He had read them, nodded politely, and continued to insist he was innocent. To the very end, Eichmann clung to the illusion that paperwork could wash away blood. In those last days, even his surroundings mirrored the world he had built, mechanical, controlled, and devoid of feeling. Every door was checked, every key logged, every meal weighed to the gram. The state wanted nothing that resembled vengeance, only completion. And yet, beneath that mechanical calm, emotions churned. In the barracks, young guards whispered about the man in cell 7. They had seen him smile once or twice, a tight, professional curve of the lips that made them shiver. He seemed proud of his efficiency, even now. "He's so normal," one guard said. "That's the scariest part." Outside the prison walls, the world waited. Some demanded mercy, voices from abroad urging Israel to show restraint, to avoid turning justice into retribution. Others demanded nothing less than death, arguing that anything else would betray the memory of the murdered. The Israeli cabinet debated deep into the night, weighing law against morality, precedent against conscience. In the end, they reached the same conclusion as the court. There could be no pardon. The man who had organized the machinery of extermination would be undone by the machinery of law. At the same time, Eichmann's wife, Vera, wrote from Argentina, pleading for one last visit. The authorities had allowed her to see him a month earlier, separated by iron bars. She had cried. He had not. Their conversation, witnesses said, was disturbingly casual, about appeals, about money, about the children. When she left, she turned back only once. He did not. Inside the cell, Eichmann continued his routines as if nothing had changed. He wrote letters to his sons, instructing them to be strong, to honor their fatherland. There was no mention of what that fatherland had done, no acknowledgement of what he had made it into. To the end, his patriotism was selective. He could love nations, but not people. As the sun set on the 29th, the guards noticed the change in the air. The usual hum of the prison dimmed to a tense quiet. Somewhere beyond the walls, carpenters worked through the night, building the gallows. Each measurement was exact. The rope was tested again and again, its length calibrated to Eichmann's weight. No mistakes, No spectacle, only precision. At midnight, the furnace that Zelikovsky had built began its final test run. It glowed white-hot in a sealed warehouse, its temperature gauge climbing past 1700 degrees. The hum of its fans filled the dark like a mechanical heartbeat. When the engineers were satisfied, they turned it off and stood in silence. They knew exactly what it was for, even if they never said it aloud. Back at Ramla, Shalom Nugger walked his final patrol before dawn. He paused outside cell 7 and listened. Inside, Eichmann was awake, writing by the dim light of his bulb. The sound of the pen was steady, rhythmic, like a man balancing an account. Nugger wondered what it must feel like to know the exact number of hours left to live and yet remain so composed. For a brief moment, pity flickered, then vanished, replaced by something heavier than hatred, comprehension. This man had never seen himself as evil. That was the true horror. By morning, the news of the court's decision spread across the world. In New York, the Times printed it beneath the headline, Eichmann's death sentence upheld. In Buenos Aires, where he had lived for years under an alias, old neighbors claimed they had always suspected something. In Germany, the silence was awkward, broken only by official statements acknowledging the legality of Israel's process. And in Israel itself, the reaction was subdued. There was no cheering in the streets, no dancing, no triumph. The people had lived with ghosts too long to celebrate the end of one man. As the day wore on, Ramla Prison settled into a grim routine. Eichmann's meals were brought on time. The guards checked his cell every 15 minutes. He asked for more paper and was given it. When he finished a page, he stacked it carefully, aligning the edges with almost obsessive neatness. The pile grew taller, filled with self-pitying prose about duty, discipline, and obedience. Never once did he write the word sorry. That evening, Father William Hull, a Canadian priest serving as the prison chaplain, was summoned to cell 7. He found Eichmann sitting upright on his cot, his gray prison uniform pressed, his shoes polished. "Do you wish to make confession?" the priest asked. There was a pause, the kind that stretches long enough to make hope seem possible. Then Eichmann shook his head. "I followed my orders," he said. "I did my duty as a German officer." Hull looked at him for a long moment. Later he would say it was like talking to an empty room. There was intelligence, even courtesy, but not a trace of remorse. The man had dismantled his own humanity long before others came to dismantle him. That night, as Jerusalem slept, the machinery of justice moved forward with quiet precision. The gallows were completed. The furnace was loaded onto a military truck under armed escort and driven south to Ramla. Every road it traveled was sealed. Every checkpoint was cleared in advance. The convoy reached the prison shortly before dawn. There was no announcement, no paperwork stamped urgent. Only the sound of heavy doors opening, closing, locking again. When the sun rose on May 30th, Adolf Eichmann had exactly 24 hours left. He spent the morning revising his notes, adjusting commas, rewording sentences that no one would ever read. At one point, he smiled faintly, as if satisfied with the phrasing. Perhaps, in his mind, history was just another report to be filed, another task to complete. To the guards, the sight was unbearable. They had seen killers before, thieves, soldiers, terrorists, but never anyone so detached from the meaning of what he had done. He was tidy, one recalled. Always tidy, even in his evil. Outside, the Israeli cabinet gathered for an emergency meeting. Letters had arrived overnight from foreign governments urging clemency. Some argued that executing Eichmann would make him a martyr for neo-Nazis. Others said imprisonment would suffice. But Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion was resolute. "He organized the extermination of our people," he said. "He has shown no remorse, no recognition, no humanity. Justice demands completion." That decision sealed Eichmann's fate. In the afternoon, the guards noticed him humming softly. They could not recognize the tune. Perhaps an old marching song from his youth, perhaps nothing at all. He stopped when he saw them watching and returned to his writing. As night fell, Shalom Nugger made his final inspection before heading home. He passed cell 7, looked through the bars, and saw Eichmann lying on his back, hands folded neatly on his chest, eyes open toward the ceiling. For the first time, Nugger thought he looked human, fragile, small, mortal. But then he remembered what those hands had signed, what those eyes had witnessed without flinching. The feeling passed. He turned away and walked down the corridor. Behind him, The prisoner resumed his writing. The pen scratched against the paper, steady as ever. Outside, the sky turned the color of ash. In the stillness of that night, the two men, the guard and the condemned, existed in parallel worlds only a few feet apart. One carried the weight of history without wanting it. The other denied history even as it closed in on him. Between them hung the quiet hum of the prison's electric lights, a sound as relentless as the ticking of a clock neither could stop. And so ended the day the Supreme Court of Israel delivered its final judgment on Adolf Eichmann, a day not of triumph or vengeance, but of solemn reckoning. The machinery of justice had begun its final countdown, and the man who once scheduled trains to Auschwitz was now, for the first time, on someone else's timetable. The morning that followed was colder than anyone expected. Ramla Prison, normally buzzing with the noises of routine, guards calling names, metal doors clanging shut, moved as if under a spell. Everyone knew what day it was. They did not speak it aloud, but the air was thick with the knowledge. The execution of Adolf Eichmann was no longer a rumor, no longer a line in a legal document. It was a clock that had begun to tick. Shalom Nugger woke before dawn. His wife, Ora, was still asleep beside their infant son. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, unaware that the next 24 hours would mark him for the rest of his life. At the prison, his name was already written on the duty roster, one of 22 men assigned to guard cell 7 until the very end. When he arrived, the corridors were unusually clean. The warden had ordered fresh whitewash on the walls, as if the building itself needed cleansing. Even the air smelled sharper, heavy with disinfectant and anxiety. Guards whispered instructions, double-checking keys, and watched shifts. Every action had been planned down to seconds. Israel would carry out its first and only execution not as vengeance, but as demonstration that even justice could be precise. Inside his cell, Eichmann sat with the same calmness that had unsettled everyone since his capture. He had requested a cup of black coffee and was drinking it slowly, one measured sip at a time. A stack of handwritten pages lay beside him, neatly squared at the corners. When a guard slid open the food hatch to deliver breakfast, he said thank you in formal German, his tone that of a man checking into a train station rather than awaiting death. At 9 o'clock a priest was escorted in, Father William Hull, the Canadian chaplain. He carried a small leather Bible and the weight of a question that had followed every visitor. Would this man, at last, admit what he had done? Hull entered quietly. Eichmann rose, nodded courteously, and offered a chair. Their conversation lasted almost half an hour. When it ended, the priest looked drained. He later wrote that he had not met a monster, but a void, an emptiness so complete that it chilled him more than rage ever could. Eichmann had said simply, I followed my orders. I did my duty as a German officer. The rest of the morning passed with bureaucratic rhythm. Papers were filed, telephones answered, messages transmitted to the Ministry of Justice and the Prime Minister's office. Outside the walls, reporters gathered, their cameras trained on the gate. Some believed the execution might still be delayed by international pressure. Others suspected that, like so many of the Nazis' own operations, it would proceed with ruthless punctuality. In the workshop behind the prison, soldiers tested the cremation furnace delivered the night before. Its metal doors hissed as heat rolled out in invisible waves. One engineer checked the gauge, 1800 degrees Celsius. Perfect. The machine designed to erase the body of a man who had tried to erase an entire people was ready. By noon, the temperature outside had climbed, but the prison remained cool and shadowed. Shalom Nugger sat in the guardroom, reading from a small book of psalms to steady his hands. Across the hall, the warden received another telegram, this one from President Yitzhak Ben-Zvi's office. Eichmann's handwritten plea for clemency had been reviewed. The answer was final, no grounds for pardon. Sentence to be carried out as scheduled. The news spread quickly, though no one spoke of it above a whisper. The execution was set for midnight. 13 hours remained. Eichmann was informed shortly after lunch. When the warden delivered the message, he looked up, adjusted his glasses, and said only, I understand. Then he returned to his writing. He was preparing what he called his final statement, a document meant to clarify his role for history. Page after page repeated the same refrain. He was a minor official, a functionary, a man of duty. The words were dry, emotionless, meticulously phrased. as if he were still reporting to Himmler's office. In the afternoon, the Israeli cabinet met for the last time to confirm the decision. Justice Minister Dov Joseph read the legal opinion. Foreign Minister Golda Meir summarized the flood of cables from abroad. Some came from church leaders urging mercy, others from survivors demanding the rope. When the vote was taken, it was unanimous. The sentence would be carried out that night. Back at Ramla, the sky began to turn a dusty orange. Eichmann requested to write letters to his family. He composed 3, one for his wife, Vera, and one for each of his sons. They were brief, stripped of tenderness. "Be strong," he wrote. "Remain loyal to the family and to the fatherland." Even in farewell, he could not separate loyalty from ideology. He ended each letter with Heil Hitler, then carefully folded the pages and sealed them in envelopes. At 7 that evening, dinner was served, a small portion of cheese, bread, a cup of tea. He ate half, then pushed the tray away. The guards noted his composure. He thanked them politely. Not one of them could find anger or fear in his face. Outside, the prison yard had been transformed. Soldiers had erected a high wooden scaffold under a canvas canopy to block the view from above. The rope hung coiled and ready. The mechanism was tested again and again, its hinges greased, its drop measured to ensure a quick, clean break. The trapdoor was calibrated to his exact weight, 170 pounds. It would open with a single pull. At 8 o'clock, news of the denied clemency broke across the world. In London, radio announcers interrupted evening programs to report it. In New York, newspapers prepared special editions. At Ramla, journalists from Reuters, the Associated Press, the BBC, and a few local outlets were escorted inside to witness history. Among them was Paul Ben-Kim, a survivor from Hungary who had once seen Eichmann with his own eyes during the deportations from Budapest. For him, tonight would not be journalism. It would be closure. As the hour approached, the mood inside the prison thickened. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even footsteps seemed quieter. The guards rotated for the final shift. Shalom Nugger's name came up again in the warden's log. He would be on duty until morning. He thought nothing of it. He believed another guard would be chosen to pull the lever. At 10, the chaplain returned to cell 7 to offer last rites. Eichmann accepted mechanically, reciting prayers in halting German, though his tone betrayed no faith. He declined the offer of a blindfold. "I will face my death," he said. His only request was that the rope not scratch his neck too deeply. An hour later, the final confirmation arrived from Jerusalem. Proceed at midnight. The warden signed the acknowledgement. The paperwork, authorizations, medical attendance forms, witness lists, was placed neatly in a folder. Everything, even death, required documentation. Outside, the night had turned cool. A faint breeze moved through the courtyard, stirring the dust beneath the gallows. The furnace in the workshop began to hum again, its orange glow flickering against the walls. At home in Holon, Shalom Nugger had been granted the next day off. He walked with his wife and baby son through quiet streets, unaware that a police van was already on its way to find him. When it arrived, lights flashing, he thought someone had escaped. Then he saw the faces inside, the warden, 2 officers, and he knew. "I won the lottery," he said bitterly. He kissed his wife goodbye as she began to cry, not realizing those cries would echo in his dreams for decades. The van raced back to Ramla through the dark. Inside, no one spoke. The only sound was the rumble of the tires and the rapid ticking of the dashboard clock. By the time they reached the gate, it was 11:30. Inside the prison, preparations were complete. Guards lined the corridor leading from cell 7 to the gallows. The witnesses, 4 journalists, the priest, the attorney general, stood in the courtyard under dim light. Each knew they were about to see something unprecedented, Israel's first and only execution. Eichmann was told it was time. He rose immediately, buttoned his jacket, and straightened the collar. He carried himself like a man reporting for duty. 2 guards stepped beside him, one on each arm. The corridor stretched long and narrow ahead, 13 paces to the platform. As he walked, no one spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic clack of his boots on the concrete floor. To the observers, it felt like the echo of every march, every order, every train that had left Europe bound for death. When he reached the scaffold, Father Hull stepped forward. "Do you have any last words?" he asked. Eichmann's eyes were steady. Long live Germany, he said. Long live Austria. Long live Argentina. I had to obey the laws of war and my flag. I am ready. No mention of the millions whose ashes still darkened the skies of Europe. No trace of guilt. Only allegiance to flags, not to humanity. The priest stepped back. The noose was placed around Eichmann's neck. The hood was offered. He refused. I will not cover my face. Behind him, Shalom Nugger took position beside the lever. His hands shook, not from fear but from the knowledge of what history demanded. The warden gave the signal. The seconds stretched thin, then vanished. Midnight. The lever dropped. The trapdoor opened with a dull thud. Eichmann's body fell, the rope snapped tight, and the movement ceased. Death came instantly. Faster, cleaner, more merciful than the deaths he had engineered for others. The witnesses watched in silence. No one applauded. The priest closed his Bible. The doctors waited a full hour, then checked for heartbeat, pulse, breath. None remained. At 2 minutes past midnight on June 1st, 1962, Adolf Eichmann was pronounced dead. The work, however, was not yet finished. The same meticulous care that had governed the trial now governed the disposal. His body was cut down and laid on a stretcher. As Nugger and 2 others lifted it, air escaped from the lungs, producing a terrible sound, half sigh, half gasp. For an instant Nugger thought the man had returned to life. Later he would say it felt as if 6 million souls had exhaled through that corpse. But it was only air, only physics. And yet that sound would haunt him for the rest of his days. The corpse was placed inside the furnace at precisely 1 a.m. Flames roared to life. The smell of burning cloth, then flesh, filled the chamber. Guards stood watch as the temperature climbed to its peak. There were no words, no prayers. Only the mechanical rhythm of the fan and the crackle of combustion. By dawn, nothing remained but gray ash. The ashes were swept into a metal urn no larger than a helmet. At sunrise, a police boat left the port of Jaffa carrying 6 men and that single urn. They sailed 12 nautical miles into international waters. The sea was calm, the sky a thin blue line. The captain opened the lid. One of the guards tilted the urn, and a cloud of gray dust drifted into the wind. Within seconds it was gone, dissolved into the Mediterranean. No grave, no monument, no relic for worshippers of hate. When they returned to shore, the official statement was read over Israel radio. The death sentence passed on Adolf Eichmann has been carried out. Nothing more. No detail, no embellishment. Just the fact, delivered with the restraint of a nation that understood the difference between justice and revenge. Back in Ramla, the gallows stood empty under the morning light. The rope, still swaying gently, cast a thin shadow on the wall. The guards removed it, disassembled the platform, and carried the pieces away. By afternoon, there was no trace of what had happened there. No marker, no sign, only the echo of footsteps fading down the corridor. Shalom Nugger sat alone in the guardroom, staring at his hands. They trembled uncontrollably. He washed them over and over at the sink until his skin turned raw, but the trembling did not stop. That night, when he finally went home, he said nothing to his wife. He held his baby son, kissed the child's forehead, and wept quietly into the dark. Years later, he would tell interviewers that he did not kill Eichmann out of hatred. He had done it because someone had to. Because history demanded a witness who would follow the law even when the law carried unbearable weight. I fulfilled a commandment, he said. God told us to erase Amalek, the enemy of mercy, but not to forget. In that moment, as the ashes of Eichmann scattered into the sea, something larger than punishment had taken place. It was not about a man dying on a rope. It was about an idea that no crime was too old, no criminal too distant, no bureaucracy too intricate to escape accountability. The machine that had once transported millions to death had been reversed, piece by piece, until it delivered justice instead. And somewhere, in the quiet dawn above the Mediterranean, the wind carried away the last trace of the man who had tried to make murder efficient. The sea absorbed him, indifferent and eternal. The world turned another page. When the news spread that Eichmann was gone, the reaction across the world was strangely muted. There were no crowds cheering in the streets of Jerusalem, no photographs of flags waving under headlines of victory. Israel, a country built by survivors, understood better than anyone that the death of one man could not balance the scales of 6 million lives. But the meaning of that night reached far beyond vengeance. It rewrote the boundaries of justice. In classrooms and editorial rooms, people began to ask a question that would echo for decades. How could a man so ordinary be responsible for something so monstrous? The philosopher and writer Hannah Arendt, who had covered the trial for The New Yorker, offered an answer that was both simple and terrifying. Evil, she wrote, is not always born from hatred or madness. It can emerge from obedience, from people who stop thinking, who trade conscience for compliance. She called it the banality of evil. Eichmann was her proof. That phrase spread quickly, shaping how future generations would understand genocide. The horror of the Holocaust was no longer defined only by its brutality, but by its bureaucracy, the schedules, the memos, the neat signatures that turned murder into office work. Eichmann had not looked like a demon. He had looked like a clerk. That was precisely why he mattered. His trial forced the world to confront a new truth, that evil could wear a suit and tie, that it could clock in at 9 and go home at 5. The transcripts from the proceedings became a record more complete than any before it. Over 3,000 pages of testimony, 100 witnesses, 1,600 documents bearing his name. Each was a fragment of a machine that had once consumed a continent. Survivors described the trains, the ghettos, the selections. For many of them, it was the first time they had spoken publicly. The trial had given them not only a platform, but a language to reclaim what had been stolen, their individuality, their humanity. For the first time, the Holocaust was not just a statistic. It was a story told by those who had lived it. Prosecutor Gideon Hausner stood before the court and said words that would define every war crimes trial that came after. "I do not stand alone," he declared. "With me at this moment stand 6 million accusers." He was right. They stood not in the courtroom, but in every page, every photograph, every name etched into the record. Eichmann's death, then, was not the end of a man. It was the beginning of a movement. It gave legal shape to something the world had never attempted, holding individuals personally responsible for crimes committed by a state. From Jerusalem's courtroom, a direct line stretched to Nuremberg and then outward, to Cambodia, to Rwanda, to Bosnia, to Darfur. Each time the world confronted genocide again, lawyers and judges invoked the same precedent. That time does not erase guilt, and "I was following orders" is no defense. By the 1990s, when the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia began its work, the prosecutors quoted directly from the Eichmann case. When the Rwandan courts sentenced those who had planned the massacre of the Tutsi, they did the same. When the International Criminal Court was founded in 2002, its architects cited Jerusalem as one of their cornerstones. The rope that ended one life had become a thread woven through the law of nations. But the trial's legacy did not live only in courtrooms. It changed education. It changed memory. Before Eichmann, many schools avoided teaching the Holocaust in detail. Afterward, it became a central lesson in understanding moral responsibility. The black and white footage of survivors testifying, faces trembling but voices steady, was broadcast around the world. Children who had never heard of Treblinka or Auschwitz suddenly knew them as places where humanity had failed itself. They learned how a piece of paper could condemn thousands, how a single line on a schedule could decide life or death. The language of bureaucracy, special treatment, evacuation, relocation, was exposed for what it really was: camouflage for killing. Every generation since has been taught to listen for those words, to question authority when it speaks in euphemisms. Eichmann's trial also forced nations to examine their own complicity. Germany had to face not only its leaders, but its citizens, the train conductors, the clerks, the secretaries, who had made genocide possible by doing their jobs. It forced the world to recognize that the Holocaust had not been a single monstrous act, but millions of small ones, carried out by people who stopped asking whether what they were doing was right. For Israel, the trial had a different resonance. It gave survivors a voice, but it also marked the young state's declaration that Jewish suffering would never again be anonymous. The same people once marched to their deaths in silence now stood in a courtroom, naming their tormentors one by one. For a nation still defining itself, that was not just justice, it was rebirth. Shalom Nugger carried his own version of that rebirth in silence. For years after the execution, he tried to live as if nothing had happened. He left the prison service, grew a beard, studied Torah. When asked about that night, he would change the subject. But the memories never faded. The weight of the lever, the gasp of air, the way the rope had swung gently in the dark. He came to believe he had not taken a life, but fulfilled a divine commandment. In Jewish tradition, Amalek represents the archetype of merciless evil, an enemy that must be erased so that goodness can survive. "I erased Amalek," he said once, "and I did not forget." He lived until 2024, dying quietly at 88. With him passed the last living connection to Eichmann's final moments. Yet his act, heavy as it was, stood as proof that justice can exist without vengeance, that even the most unspeakable crimes can meet the law, not the mob. The world that followed tried, imperfectly, to live by that principle. Each new generation of lawyers, historians, and soldiers faced its own Eichmanns, men and women who claimed they were only doing their jobs while carrying out horrors. And each time, the question arose again, is justice enough? The answer was never simple. The Holocaust had been singular, but its lessons were not. Cambodia's killing fields, Rwanda's rivers, the ruins of Srebrenica, all bore the echo of that courtroom in Jerusalem. Every time a witness pointed to a defendant and said, "That was the man," the spirit of Gideon Hausner's words returned. 6 million accusers stood again, invisible but present, reminding the world that memory is not passive. It is a duty. And yet, the lesson of Eichmann goes beyond law. It is a warning about human nature itself. He was not born a monster. He was born a son, a student, a salesman. Somewhere along the line, he found purpose in obedience, comfort in structure, meaning in serving something larger than himself. He stopped thinking, and in doing so, he stopped being human. That is why his story endures. Because it tells us that civilization can collapse not with screams, but with paperwork, not with hate, but with indifference. In offices around the world, historians still study his files, the meticulous records of transports, the budgets, the signatures. Each one is a reminder that genocide is not the product of chaos, but of order abused. The same efficiency that can build a hospital can also build a death camp if conscience disappears. For all its horror, Eichmann's end proved something profoundly human. It showed that law could outlast terror, that even when monsters hide behind rules, rules can be rewritten to hold them accountable. It showed that democracy could face its darkest enemy and not become him. In the years since, Israel has never executed another person. The gallows at Ramla were dismantled, the furnace scrapped, the documents archived. Justice had spoken once, and once was enough. Today, when international courts summon war criminals, when survivors testify against generals and presidents, when the phrase "crimes against humanity" is read aloud, the shadow of that night in 1962 still lingers. The trapdoor that opened beneath Adolf Eichmann did more than end his life. It opened a new era of accountability. If you listen closely, you can still hear it, the faint creak of the rope, the stillness that followed, the whisper carried across the sea as his ashes disappeared. It is not the sound of vengeance. It is the sound of memory insisting on justice. Because in the end, the story of Adolf Eichmann is not about how he died, but about what humanity chose to do after he was gone. It is a story that reminds us that evil does not need to roar. It only needs silence. And that silence can be broken by truth, by courage, by law. And so, in the final accounting, when the clock stopped ticking for the architect of death, another clock began. A clock that still runs today in every courtroom where victims speak, in every classroom where history is taught, in every act of resistance against cruelty disguised as order. The machine he built to destroy humanity was dismantled, piece by piece, until what remained was something entirely new, the machinery of justice. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring victory of all. The sea that swallowed Eichmann's ashes was calm that morning, almost serene. The sun rose over the Mediterranean as if nothing extraordinary had happened. No one aboard the small police boat spoke. They simply watched the gray dust disappear into the wind, dissolve into water, and vanish without a trace. It was over. But the story of Adolf Eichmann, what he represented, what he revealed about human nature, had only begun. In the years that followed, The world tried to move forward, to bury the scars of war beneath progress and prosperity. But the echoes of that trial refused to fade. For many, it was the first time they had heard the details spoken aloud, the trains, the orders, the language of extermination disguised as logistics. The trial had not just condemned a man. It had forced humanity to look at itself. Eichmann's death left behind no grave to visit, no monument to topple. Instead, it left behind a question: how does a person become capable of such things? The answer, as the decades unfolded, became the foundation of an uncomfortable truth. Evil is not extraordinary. It is ordinary people surrendering their judgment to systems that reward obedience over conscience. That lesson reached beyond history books. In every era, new bureaucracies rose, new slogans promised safety, and new voices whispered that obedience was virtue. The danger, the philosophers warned, was not only in those who command, but in those who comply. The man who filed the papers, who sealed the train car, who nodded and looked away, he, too, was part of the machinery. It was this realization that reshaped the modern world's moral architecture. Schools began teaching not only what happened, but how it happened. In Germany, young students walked through former camps with their teachers. In Poland, guides explained how neighbors became informants. In America, classrooms discussed what responsibility means in the face of authority. Every lesson carried the same heartbeat: never again, and not because governments promised, but because individuals remembered. The documents from the trial, once stored in archives, became exhibits in museums. Visitors stood before Eichmann's handwriting, neat, precise, soulless, and felt a chill at the thought that this, too, was human. Curators didn't present the case as a relic, but as a mirror. The reflection was uncomfortable. It still is. For survivors, the trial brought a kind of fragile peace. Many of them had spent decades believing the world did not want to hear their pain. Jerusalem proved otherwise. For the first time, their words were recorded, translated, and broadcast across nations. They were no longer faceless victims. They were witnesses, people whose memories anchored the truth against the tides of denial. And as long as those testimonies existed, Eichmann's attempt to erase them had failed. But memory, like justice, is not static. It requires caretakers. As generations changed, the danger shifted from forgetting to distortion. Conspiracy and denial crept into the edges of public discourse, twisting facts, mocking survivors, turning atrocity into argument. That, too, was a form of obedience to ignorance, to convenience, to comfort. And each time it appeared, educators, journalists, and ordinary citizens returned to the same evidence, the same courtroom, the same question: have we learned? The answer has never been simple. The 20th century ended with new camps, new exoduses, new graves. Yet each time the world faced them, the blueprint of Jerusalem's justice returned. In The Hague, when Slobodan Milosevic stood trial, prosecutors cited Eichmann's precedent. In Kigali, when the architects of Rwanda's genocide were sentenced, they invoked the same principle: command does not absolve. And in every human rights tribunal since, the quiet example of that night in 1962 has whispered from behind the legal text, reminding us that justice must be methodical, not vengeful. But the legacy of Eichmann's end is not only about law. It is about moral vigilance. Evil thrives in silence, in paperwork, in phrases like, "just doing my job." The antidote is inconvenient. It demands thought, empathy, resistance. It demands that when orders cross the line of conscience, someone stands up and says no. Perhaps that is the deepest meaning of Shalom Nugger's act. When he pulled the lever, he did not end a man. He completed a lesson. He showed that duty could serve justice, that the machinery of the state could be used not to kill, but to affirm life's value. For decades he lived quietly, never boasting, never exploiting what he had done. When he spoke in old age, his words were measured, sorrowful. I did not kill him out of hate. I did what the law required. There is grace in that restraint. In an age that celebrates outrage, it is worth remembering that the truest form of justice is often silent. It is the patience to gather facts, the courage to confront them, and the humility to act without cruelty. Today, as wars rage and governments justify violence in the name of order, Eichmann's story feels uncomfortably familiar. Once again, bureaucrats draft documents that decide who belongs and who does not. Once again, leaders claim necessity as they trample empathy. And once again, ordinary people face the same choice that defined the 20th century: to think or to obey. The trapdoor at Ramla is gone now. The room that held it was repurposed, its walls repainted. Tourists who visit the prison see nothing unusual. But if you stand in that quiet corridor and close your eyes, you can almost hear the echo, the wooden creak, the final thud, the sound of a world holding its breath. That sound is not triumph. It is warning, because the truth that Jerusalem revealed will always be uncomfortable. It tells us that monsters are not born, they are built. They are built out of fear, ambition, indifference, and the thousand small compromises that ordinary people make every day. That is why the story must be told again and again, not to glorify punishment, but to remind us what happens when humanity forgets itself. In the end, Eichmann's execution was not about death. It was about survival, the survival of conscience, of law, of moral clarity. It was about proving that justice could exist even after the world had seen its worst. And it was about ensuring that those who follow orders blindly would never again be able to hide behind their uniforms. The Mediterranean has long since washed away the ashes of the man who called himself a servant of duty. But it has not washed away the memory of what he did, or what his trial taught us. His name, once a symbol of power, is now a caution whispered wherever people speak of responsibility. Every time a student reads his story, every time a survivor's voice trembles through a recording, every time a court summons a tyrant to stand before the world, the same current moves through time. It says, we remember. We bear witness. We think. The last image of Eichmann alive, a man standing on a wooden platform, refusing the hood, claiming loyalty to nations but not to humanity, should never fade. It is not the image of victory, but of warning. It asks us, each in our own time, to choose whether we will be bureaucrats of cruelty or custodians of conscience. Justice, like memory, demands work. It demands that we keep asking the question Hannah Arendt asked in that courtroom. What makes us human when the system asks us not to be? That question is the real verdict. It is the sentence that history passed not on Eichmann, but on us. And so, as the waves continue to erase and rewrite the shorelines of the Mediterranean, the world carries forward the invisible trace of that night in 1962. A rope fell, a body dropped, and the machinery of hate came to a stop. In its silence, another sound emerged, the quiet hum of accountability, of thought, of moral responsibility. It has not stopped since. Because justice, when it is true, never ends with a death. It begins with remembrance. A single photograph survives from that night in Ramla Prison. A wooden platform, a length of rope, the outline of a body already gone. There is no blood, no violence, only stillness. Yet in that stillness lies a sound that has never stopped echoing. It is the sound of justice, quiet but absolute. In the years since, historians, survivors, and students have returned to that moment as if to touch the pulse of history itself. Each time they read the transcripts or hear the recordings, they rediscover the same paradox, that evil can be ordinary, but so can courage. What makes the difference is choice. Adolf Eichmann's name has faded from headlines, but his trial remains a living heartbeat inside every courtroom that dares to confront power. When witnesses in Rwanda, Bosnia, or Ukraine step forward and point to those who gave the orders, they do so in the shadow of Jerusalem, 1961. The principle born there, that no rank, distance, or time can shield a man from responsibility, is the reason the world still believes in law. But the true legacy lies not in law alone. It lies in memory, because justice is not self-sustaining. It survives only when people remember enough to demand it. The silence of obedience built the camps. The noise of conscience dismantled them. Every generation must decide which sound it will make. If you listen closely, you can hear the Mediterranean that morning, washing over the ashes scattered to the wind. The water carries no hatred, only the echo of a promise whispered by those who survived. Never again. That promise was never about revenge. It was about vigilance, about ensuring that no one, anywhere, could ever again hide behind the words "I was only following orders." The trapdoor at Ramla has long since vanished, but its message endures. Justice need not shout. It does not rush. It moves with the same patience as the tide, erasing what must be erased and leaving behind what must be learned. And every time we remember, every time we teach, every time we question, the world tightens the knot that binds morality to law. Because justice, real justice, is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of conscience. Fade out. Low strings, one final toll of a clock. Silence.